pass you over to David, and we're very lucky to have him. So enjoy.
Oops, it's gone again. So there we go. The slides there. You can see that on the screen.
We're on your there we go. Now we've got it.
Excellent. Shall I start?
You can start.
Good evening, everybody, and good afternoon, anybody who's watching from the beautiful state of Minnesota. I'm sure there's thousands signed in from Minnesota just to watch me. So today, I've been invited to talk about a paper we published 2 weeks ago. But this slide obviously doesn't say what the paper is. This is a proposal for you. You often hear people talking about patient-centered approaches. So today, I'm going to try and persuade you in the first few minutes of this presentation that we should probably switch from patient-centered to person-focused. And we'll ask the question, will it make a difference? And I've been accused of it being pedantic or just wordsmith, but I'm going to try and propose the reasons behind why I think person-focused is a better choice of term than patient-centered. And in the recent paper we published, which we're going to talk about and discuss, we actually used the term person-focused throughout the paper by choice rather than patient-centered, and we'll discuss a few of the reasons why we did that. So here, oops, there we go. The paper we just published is called Don't Be a Nocebo, and hopefully people had a chance to download that paper, and it's free open access. And why healthcare organizations should value patients' expectations is one of the things we'll talk about. But before I do that, I'd just like to say that this is a massive team effort to get a paper like this out. It's not a long paper, but it's an involved paper. And what that means is that everybody involved in this paper was involved in doing research on the topic, was involved in writing, and was involved in editing. And I'm just lucky that these guys put my name first. That's my first statement. And if you ever look at the names, I know that Maxie Mashek has presented to this group, and she's an expert and a researcher in Edmonton in Canada. And her expertise is looking at therapeutic alliances, shared decision-making, and qualitative research on that subject. Jerry Durham is a consultant who looks at how to improve front desk interaction for people and patients. And his work was invaluable in giving us ideas about how the front desk staff can better interact with patients and people. Alvisa is a Polish nursing professor, but she's practicing in Udine in Italy. And her speciality is the placebo effect and nocebo effects. And our leader, Giacomo Rosentini, who hails from Verona in Italy, he's a professor at 2 universities. He's in Verona and in Rome. And his speciality is contextual effects, and writing about that and how that has an effect on our patients and the interactions that we have as clinicians. So basically, the team is made up of 3 PhDs, a consultant, and then poor old me, who's the 41-year-old clinician with patient context experience. And my speciality is I write about patient-centered, person-focused care and self-treatment. So that's my background. And just to give you a little insight, even though I have a pretty strong English accent still, I haven't lived in the UK for 41 years. And as a therapist, I trained in Wakefield in West Yorkshire and practiced for 4 or 5 years in the UK in various fields, and then emigrated with my wife, who was a nurse, to Australia, to the outback of Victoria. We spent 6 years in Victoria. I was a therapist in a clinic for a year, in a hospital clinic for a year, and then I opened a private practice for 5 years in the small town that we lived in. Then I had an opportunity to go and do the Mackenzie Diploma course, which is a method of self-treatment in back pain. So once again, we upped ourselves. By this time, we had 2 small children, and we moved to Wellington, New Zealand, just outside Wellington, where I taught the Mackenzie Diploma course with Robin Mackenzie for 3 years. Then we decided to move the diploma course to where I live now and work, to Minnesota, a place called Coon Rapids. So we've had quite a hop in our lives, and we spent the last 28 years living in and working in Coon Rapids. I also worked in West Africa for a while, a volunteer in Niger, and had to treat my patients in French. And my French is passable, but that was a wonderful experience too, and taught me about how to communicate with people, not just by language, but by body and touch and positions when you can't communicate via your own language. Then I also have a house in France, and I spend a lot of time traveling backwards and forwards between the US and France. And that's got less and less, of course, because of Brexit. The less we say about that, the better. So here's a question. What is the meaning of 8,760? Me being silent allows you to think. We always worry about people being silent in presentations. So what is the meaning of 8,760? The answer is simple. Well, may not be obvious, but it's simple. It is the number of hours in 1 year, minus 5.83. And of course, this year we get an extra 24 because it's a leap year. So this year would be, what is 8,784? And the reason I point this out is even if you have persistent pain, even if you're living with a chronic, persistent medical condition, you are more likely to spend the vast majority of 8,760 hours being a person than you are being a patient. And what I mean by that is, when we talk about the word patient, it's a label given to us by medical practitioners or the healthcare system. So I'm going to propose that we look at people and focus on the whole person rather than just looking at them as a patient and centering on them. So here is a patient, and they're in the center of the picture. Now, I'm going to propose two things: that we switch from patient to person, and we switch from this term centered to focused. And the reason I say that is because this patient person is also centered, but centered to the left-hand side of the screen, which means our focus has now gone to the left. This person, patient, is also centered, but this time centered to the right hand. And the reason I mention this is the centered government of America is on the East Coast in Washington, DC. The same in my other homeland, Australia. The center of government is on the East Coast in Australia's capital territories, and it's not in the middle. So this is the proposal. Center doesn't mean middle. It means focus care. So when we talk about patient-centered, this is a model. Actually, this is one of the models from the NHS, where we place the patient in the middle of the healthcare system. And I think if we switch our thought process and switch our paradigm to looking at a person and focusing on that person, rather than thinking of them as a patient in the middle of a healthcare system. And one of the things I say to clinicians, you can't focus on a person if you're standing too close to them. So I've proposed going from what we call the microscopic view of our patients in the center to a global focus, which is a macroscopic view. And we talk about this, we talk about the biopsychosocial. Well, if you look at a macroscopic view, that sees the whole person. And when we talk about focus, we can draw out the focus so we can see the big picture of the person. And the reason I'm keen on that is, if you look at a person rather than at a patient, you involve looking at their whole life. their whole interaction with the community, these social determinants of their health. Person-focused, a little quote, this is from Kieran Sweeney, who was a doctor who posted a video, and it's on my Twitter feed, about his experience as a doctor with a terminal illness. He died of mesothelioma. But one of the striking phrases that he used was, we need to move from being caring for to caring about the person. So when a person enters the healthcare system, we should be looking at how whatever they're presenting with, whatever they're living with, affects the whole person. And even Waldo explains it. Rather than where's Waldo, nobody ever asks how's Waldo. So what does a person look like? This is actually a slide I made. I presented this similar topic at the San Diego Pain Summit 2 years ago. In the right-hand bottom corner is how people see me. If you follow me on Twitter, I'm the ostrich with the head in the sand. My handle's Rhett Looping. So a lot of people know me from Twitter as the ostrich. But if you look at me as a person, in the top left-hand corner, that's my mother with me at 18 months sat on her knees. So I'm a son. That's my brother. So I'm a brother. The picture next to it on the right at the top right middle is my brothers. So I am more than just a patient. On the top right-hand corner, that's my passion, cycling. That's me in Malta cycling. So I'm a traveler. If you come to the bottom row, that's my wife and son in Amsterdam. So I'm a father. The next picture is me with Robin McKenzie. So I'm a professional, I'm a physiotherapist, physical therapist, lecturer. The next one is me in Haworth, cycling the streets of Haworth just before the Tour de France. So I'm a passionate follower of the Tour de France. The sketchy one is me with my grandson during COVID. We went to Creola World. And the one with me asleep is my granddaughter sleeping on grandpa. So if I came to your clinic suffering with or presenting with as a patient, you might need to consider that I am affecting all other avenues of my life. I am also an uncle. I am also a husband. I am also a brother-in-law. So all these things that when we see a person in a healthcare system, how often do we consider all these roles and goals and how that affects the individual? Funny enough, the same week as we had our paper published, I also had this published. So it's not just something I say, it's something I'm passionate about. And this is a proposal that even when we do things like manual therapy, we take a person-focused approach. So this is also available online if you're interested. So here's the paper. Last November, Giacomo, our leader, the guy who's in Italy, decided to invite the four of us to write a paper together. And his only purview was, it's got to be about organizations, and the subject is Nocebo. How do organizations have an adverse or a harmful effect? And that was the purview. So the four of us went away, and I do all my thinking when I'm cycling. So what I did that week was research around the topic, and there's not many papers on that topic, but I researched papers where adverse interactions with organizations, adverse interactions with therapists, adverse interactions with clinicians. And one of the things we didn't want to do was write about individual clinicians and how they have a nocebo effect. We wanted to look and focus at an organization. So after cycling, this is my thoughts. And I generally like to look at, as I said, the big picture. This is me putting everything down on paper under the microscope. And for people who've read the paper, this is basically it. This was the framework of our paper. I put this together in an afternoon. So when I'm cycling, I just let my mind wander and think. And then when I come home, I quickly wrote all this down in paper in about 10 minutes, and then I presented it to the group. And if you have read the paper and you just have a look at this, you can actually see it's the structure that formed our eventual paper. And of course, things morph over time. This was the second iteration, focusing more on the patient or the person in the model that we were using. And we wanted to look at what were the expectations of people arriving in a healthcare organization and how those expectations would be managed by clinicians, front desk staff, and the managerial organizational hierarchy. And if you look at it, it actually does form the basis where we looked at probability expectations, value expectations, and clinical expectations of the person arriving at the healthcare centre. This is the final iteration that I put together. And again, these are all in the space of probably 2 or 3 days, just to say, yep, this is what we want. So we wanted to look at an organization, and we looked at it like it was an ecosystem. So thinking that an organization is a living organism and the parts make up a bigger whole, just like any ecosystem. And what we wanted to look at is how differences in those parts would affect the individual as a person passing through the organization. And you can see how things develop. So rather than my scratchy handwriting, I decided to put a PowerPoint scratchy handwriting picture together so that we would be more clear. And what happens is, as we started to write the paper in sections, my diagrams got less and less. And the reason for that is that we have the content then written in form. And you can see how it gets less the more we've written. So what we wanted to eventually end up with was a diagram that represented what our paper was proposing. And we still have the word patient flow, if you notice. Again, we wanted to develop an idea, and as we wrote the paper and edited it, we thought we might put more and less into our final model picture. And this is where our final iteration was, we thought. But as we wrote the paper and edited it, we decided that the final iteration would be this one. And I'm looking at it, there's still a mistake in there, but it got published. We should really have person. And the reason we kept patient is because, remember, that is the label we give to the person when they enter the healthcare system. Once they leave, we would look at them as the person living with. So one of the things our paper focuses on is, do we care about the individual? Rather than caring for, do we measure the person's expectations, their probability expectation, what they perceive might happen to them in the future, their value expectation, what they currently would like in their interactions, and their clinical expectation of what care they would like to receive as they pass through the healthcare system. And one of the things we found as we did our research is there's a disconnect between management, clinicians, and front desk. And we've offered solutions or suggestions in the paper, because it's a discussion paper, to how this may change as we move forward. One of the things we looked at is what each individual in this ecosystem seems to focus on. And looking at the management, they seem to be more focused on the experience, the overall experience, rather than the patient outcome. And one of the things we found when we looked at this in the research is there's a very poor correlation between expectations and outcomes. So as clinicians, it's quite frustrating when you have good clinical outcomes, but somehow the patient didn't have a good experience or reported that to the management. And I've worked in systems where some of the best clinicians actually get the worst experience outcomes from management. And the reason for this is twofold. You can be a good clinician, but you sometimes have what I've called synergistic antagonism, where you have to explain to a person that they're not receiving the treatment they desired because it's either contraindicated or not part of the current package that's being offered. And so patients become dissatisfaction and have a poor experience, but they get better with the treatment they're provided with. So there's this disconnect. The other thing we looked at is front desk, and we looked at the UK because that's where most of the research was. And what we found was a lot of the front desks are doing more than they should do beyond what they're probably qualified for, especially in the NHS, where they are actually triaging. And they are more focused on performance outcomes. They are more focused on getting people scheduled or not scheduled. They are more focused on performance of the way the front desk runs. So what we propose in our paper is that in an organization, there needs to be better communication, and that roles and goals are defined throughout the organization rather than passed down from management above. And one of the things I wrote that's attached to the bottom is one of my favorite quotes about how nocebos, and the quote from Simon and Garfield, are silent like a cancer grows. It's too late in an organization when these things have developed. So we are proposing that this paper becomes a catalyst for change, that organizations may look at it reflectively and say, do we need to change before noceboic or harm occurs? So have a look at this. Just focus on it and ask yourself, who is this? Who is this person? And of course, she's a famous English singer, and you're all going to probably say, it's Adele. But the problem is, hello, it's stuck. Is it? So sometimes when we think we're focusing, we may have the wrong image. So to bring myself back down to earth, I was happy we got our paper published. I sent it to my wife and said, hey, we got our paper published. She sent me one text back that said, what's a nocebo? So I came crashing back down to earth and thought, good question. So nocebo, nocere from Latin means to harm. We often use it in the antonym or the opposite of placebo, and placer means to please. So the question we want to ask people is, can we prevent harm in our patients? Can we prevent displeasure in our patients? Can we prevent the organization giving people what they wanted was a positive experience, but in fact they're having a negative experience? And while I was putting this together and I was reflecting on it yesterday, Louise Turenne posted, I think you probably all know her, she was admitted to hospital. But the horrific thing that struck me was she posted she was ambulance number 19 in the waiting line, not in the queue, but in the waiting queue outside, ambulance 19 waiting to get into accident and emergency. So this stuff is happening on a day-to-day basis, not only in the UK, but everywhere else, that we are creating noceboic effects on our patients before they even get seen within the health organization. So thank you for listening. And if you want to reach out to me, you can either read all my ostrich shouting at clouds, which is what I feel like when I present at home, because I can't see anybody. I feel like I'm shouting into the void. But hopefully this is useful, and I'm looking forward to everybody's input, everybody's discussion, and everybody's feedback on our current paper.
That's brilliant. Thank you ever so much, David. You just